There is a cycle built into the sky. It takes 84 years to complete, and every time it has turned, without exception, the United States of America has been forced to confront a question it would rather not answer. On April 25th, 2026, the cycle turns again. Most people think of astrology as a personal practice, something you consult about your relationships, career choices, or the month ahead. But astrology has another branch, one that predates the personal horoscope by centuries, one that was used not to understand individuals, but to understand civilizations. It is called mundane astrology. The word comes from the Latin mundus, meaning world. It is the astrology of nations, of governments, of the turning points in collective human history. Its central premise is straightforward. Just as a person has a birth chart cast for the moment of their first breath, a nation has a birth chart cast for the moment of its political inception, the founding moment, the moment the entity comes into being. For the United States, that moment is July 4th, 1776. The signing of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And in the chart cast for that moment, among the planetary positions locked into the sky at the birth of this nation, sits Uranus at 8 degrees and 55 minutes of Gemini. That placement is not incidental. It is, in the language of mundane astrology, a founding signature, a principle encoded at birth, one that the nation will be called back to again and again, every time that planet completes its circuit of the sky and returns to where it began, every 84 years. The question mundane astrologers have been asked for decades, and with increasing urgency, is what happens each time that return occurs. The historical record is not ambiguous. Before we can understand what the return demands, we have to understand what was encoded at the founding. The Sibley chart, the birth chart of the United States, carries 3 specific signatures that mundane astrologers associate with the founding principles, not as mythology, as planetary placements with measurable historical correlations. The first is the moon. In the Sibley chart, the moon sits in Aquarius in the 3rd house. In mundane astrology, the moon represents the people, their emotional body, their collective will, their relationship to the government. Aquarius is the sign of independence, of brotherhood, of radical equality. The 3rd house governs communication, information, and the press. The founding principle encoded here: the people are sovereign, and their sovereignty is expressed through the free flow of information. This is not an interpretation. It is the First Amendment. The Virginia legislature put it more plainly in 1776, the same year the Declaration was signed. They wrote that the freedom of the press is one of the greatest bulwarks of liberty and can never be restrained but by despotic governments. The second signature is Saturn. Saturn in the Sibley chart sits in Libra, the sign of its exaltation, the placement where it operates at its most mature and principled. In mundane astrology, Saturn in Libra represents the constitutional framework, the checks and balances, the explicit structural limits placed on the accumulation of power. It sits in trine, a harmonious aspect, to natal Uranus in Gemini, the revolutionary impulse and the constitutional constraint built into the founding geometry in direct relationship to one another. The revolution was never meant to produce unchecked power. It was meant to prevent it. The president does not stand above the Constitution. The president swears to defend it. The third signature is Uranus itself. Uranus in Gemini sits conjunct the descendant, the axis of open relationships and open enemies, placed in the 6th house of the employed classes and public servants. and trine to Saturn in Libra in the 11th house of the legislature, that placement encodes a specific founding principle. The revolutionary spirit is meant to protect the working people, not merely the powerful. The Constitution as a shield, not just for the powerful, but for the civil servant, the laborer, the ordinary citizen. And Uranus does not sit there alone. Natal Mars is also in Gemini, in wide conjunction with Uranus. In mundane astrology, Mars governs military force, conflict, and direct action. Its co-presence with Uranus in the founding chart means that every time transiting Uranus returns to this degree, it also reactivates that natal Mars. The revolutionary impulse and the force of conflict encoded together at the founding, which is why each time this cycle has turned, the nation has not merely debated, it has fought. 3 principles, 1 birth chart: sovereignty of the people through free information, constitutional limits on power, the revolutionary break from illegitimate authority, protected, not abandoned by law. That is what was encoded on July 4th, 1776. That is what the return reactivates. The first time Uranus returned toward its natal position, it was still completing the founding transit. Uranus entered Gemini in 1774. The Revolutionary War began in 1775. The Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. The war ended in 1783 as Uranus left Gemini. The founding question then was the most fundamental version of the question: will this revolutionary principle take hold at all? Will self-governance survive? The pamphlets were the battlefield. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January 1776, sold 100,000 copies in 3 months in a country of 2.5 million people. The medium was Gemini. The message was Uranus. Information as the instrument of revolution. 84 years later, Uranus returned. It entered Gemini in 1858. On August 21st of that year, the exact day Uranus crossed into Gemini, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas held the first of their famous debates, 8 debates across Illinois, on the question of slavery, on the question of whether the founding promise, all men are created equal, applied to all men. Lincoln lost that Senate race, but those debates put him on the national stage. 2 years later, he was president. 1 year after that, the Civil War. The second return forced the same founding question in a different form. The Declaration said all men are created equal. The Constitution had included slavery. The gap between the founding promise and the lived reality could no longer be contained. The medium again was Gemini. The telegraph carried the war in real time to every newsroom in the country. The battle for narrative was fought through information as much as through artillery. 84 years later, Uranus returned again. It entered Gemini in 1942. The United States had entered the Second World War months earlier. The question this time: could democracy survive organized fascism? Could the founding principle that government derives its power from the consent of the governed survive a world in which that principle was being systematically dismantled across Europe? The medium again was Gemini: radio, propaganda, code breaking. The first computers, built to crack the encrypted communications, were a Gemini-Uranus invention born of existential necessity. And in 1947, as Uranus was still in Gemini, the Cold War began. Information war that would define the next half-century. The pattern is not subtle. Each return, the same founding question, a different medium, a different form of the crisis, but the same underlying confrontation between the founding promise and the forces that would narrow it, suppress it, or abandon it entirely. On April 25th, 2026, Uranus re-enters Gemini. This is its permanent settlement. It will remain until 2032. The exact Uranus return, when the planets reach the precise degree it occupied at the founding, occurs in July 2027. This is not a prediction video. Mundane astrology does not predict events. It identifies cycles, maps historical correlations, and asks what patterns the present moment belongs to. Before we can understand where this cycle begins, we have to look at where it last left off. Every 84-year cycle has a closing phase. 63 years in, the waning square. In the language of mundane astrology, the crisis of conscience. The moment the cycle asks, what did you do with what was built? That moment arrived in 2003. The United States went to war on intelligence that proved false. A free press was asked to suppress a story about the government surveilling its own citizens without warrants, and did so for a year. The executive branch was asserting power that the courts would rule later unconstitutional. The same question, the same founding principle under pressure, the same gap between what the documents say and what the government was doing. The closing square does not resolve, it crystallizes. It hands the unfinished question to the next cycle. This is that next cycle. The question it opens with is not new. It was not answered in 2003. It was not answered in the years that followed. And now Uranus returns to the degree it held when the nation was born, and the question is waiting. Every Uranus and Gemini transit has brought a confrontation over who controls information, and whether that control serves or subverts the founding principle of popular sovereignty. The medium changes each time. The question does not. In 1776, the pamphlet. In 1861, the telegraph. In 1941, the radio and the first computers. In 2026, artificial intelligence is learning to speak, to write, to reason. Social media platforms control the information diet of billions. The nature of truth itself, what is real, what is fabricated, what can be verified, is under active contestation. Uranus governs electricity, sudden breakthroughs, and in the language of modern mundane astrology, artificial intelligence. Gemini governs language, data, communication, the nervous system. The planet of AI has just entered the sign of information. Whether that convergence produces liberation or consolidation, whether it renews the founding promise or narrows it further, is not written in the sky. The sky shows the pressure. The people determine the outcome. That is, after all, what the founding documents say. "84 years. Every time this cycle has turned, the nation has been asked the same question. Not by the planets, by circumstances that the planets, in the view of mundane astrologers, are correlated with, but do not cause. Is the founding promise still operative? Does the government still derive its just powers from the consent of the governed? Does the information flow freely enough for that consent to be real?" One more thing. What we have covered today is the ingress, the moment Uranus crosses into Gemini, the beginning of the transit. But the return, the moment Uranus reaches the exact degree it occupied when this nation was born, on July 4th, 1776, that is a different event, and it does not arrive until July 2027. That is the moment mundane astrologers have been watching for decades, the precise degree. The founding frequency at full intensity. We will be there when it arrives. That investigation is already underway.